Salutations, respected viewers. I am George from Ireland. So this video is the Conservative case against Churchill. Of course, I'm alluding to Sir Winston Churchill because I'm a small C Conservative. I'm not a member of the Conservative and Unionist Party, though I might well rejoin. And Churchill is so often held up as the living embodiment of conservatism. Though, all right, he died in January 1965, but you know what I mean. The person who incarnated conservatism more so than anyone else. Small c conservatism. Difference is capital C is identifying with the party, even if you're not actually a member of it. Conservative Party in the United Kingdom or Canada. Obviously, in the United States, conservative is an alias for Republican. But then there's small c conservative, which is conservative in the broader sense, the less specifically political sense, just being a traditionalist. What would a conservative believe in? I suppose capitalism up to a point, with some exceptions, mightn't agree to free trade in sex or drugs or gambling or something. They would want to maintain things the way they are. They would have respect for parents' ancestors, just like to keep customs alive. They would be monarchists if they lived in a monarchy. They would pride themselves on being people who upheld the Constitution, who were skeptical of rapid change, or would go with Lord Falkland's dictum from the early 17th century, that which it is not necessary to change, it is necessary not to change. So they wouldn't set their face against change completely, but they would only agree to gradual and needed changes. They would start out with a prejudice against change. Conservatives would favour family values, religion, probably whatever the major denomination of that country is. They'd be very patriotic. National identity would matter deeply to them. They'd probably want quite strong armed forces. They'd take quite a punitive attitude to crime. I could go on and on. You get the idea. So they're not absolute free marketeers usually, so that they would have limits to that. They would want to maintain the social structure, the pecking order, things like that. That wouldn't be terribly concerned about inequality. They would be suspicious of government provision of welfare, not totally against it. Might be a paternalistic aspect to conservatism. All right, so amongst conservatives of all stripes, the name Churchill is often treated as the trump card. If you can cite that he's on your side, it appears to settle any argument. And the majestic sweep of his uniquely colourful and varied life holds unparalleled appeal for romantic right-wingers. Who else can possibly stand comparison to Winston S? And whenever someone in the United States or the United Kingdom calls for a military action, they will cite Churchill, or if people ever seek to maintain peace or something like that, or talk about negotiating, then it's as though Neville Chamberlain will be the Banquo's ghost of the occasion, or we can't possibly settle for anything less than war, or we'll have to get the other side to agree to all our demands, or really we're being spineless. Anyway, so Churchill is widely regarded as the United Kingdom's unofficial national hero. At Cambridge University, there's even a college named in his honour, and there's no other college out of all these 75 ones or so at Oxford and Cambridge together which is named after a UK Prime Minister. What else is named after him? There's even the Churchill Institute in the United States to immortalise his memory, to blazon forth his glory and his perpetual fame. What else? His name graces various other things, like even a hagwon in New Malden, that's London's Koreatown. There's a school in Serbia called Chartwell, as in after Churchill's country retreat in Kent. If you don't know where Kent is, that's a county outside London to the southeast. Anyway, by the way, the village of Churchill in Oxfordshire gives its name to the family. It's not the family gives its name to the village. So any criticism of Churchill, no matter how reasoned or how mild, is met with the immediate riposte. But he won the war. This boast is much exaggerated, and it's an example of the less than honest self-laudation which too many Britishers engage in relation to the Second World War. So Churchill was a man of manifold virtues and staggering achievements. So yes, he accomplished some splendid things, which any fair-minded person would applaud him for. liberals, left-wingers, they often grant it to him that, yeah, he did achieve some fantastic things. Nevertheless, his reputation is much overblown. The importance of his rhetoric and his ebullience in sustaining British morale through the gloomiest days of the Second World War should not be underestimated. So he's on a pedestal for many British conservatives, whether you're talking about with a small c or a capital C. So he seems to have a guaranteed place as one of the household gods of international conservatism, which indeed is puzzling if you study the man's record in greater detail. It's as though a quotation from him, as I say, would just torpedo the other side's argument in any policy debate. But the cult of Churchill is based on a misunderstanding of the man. Hello there, straight white British Protestant. Well, Churchill was one of you, actually. But when it comes to religiosity, I think during the Second World War, a bishop, an Anglican bishop, just described him as a pillar of the church, and Churchill quipped he was more of a flying buttress. You should read My Early Life, his autobiography, which takes us up to about the age of 30 or something. And he says that he was skeptical about Christianity. He's brought up in a Christian family, an Anglican one, that's to say they worship in the Church of England. He attended St George's School in Ascot, and that was an Anglican one. It still exists, it's now a girls' school, not a boys' one. And to Harrow School, where he, that's obviously affiliated to the Church of England, one of the most illustrious schools in the realm, and so forth. But he says, as he was not particularly religious, he attended a church, what would I say, spasmodically. So he thought that, well, even if I don't get very much, I've got a lot of credit in the bank with the Most High, since I had to attend chapel on a daily basis as a schoolboy. Anyway, so his words and deeds are so often misunderstood and misrepresented, and in many regards, as I shall later adumbrate, he was unconservative. His decanonization is long overdue, which is not to say that I take aim at everything he did, or deny him his many accomplishments, or dispute the fact that he was exceptionally gifted. Anyway, it's high time we demythologize this man, and it's dubious whether he belongs in the Tory pantheon at all. Incidentally, Tory is really a nickname for conservative in Canada as well as in the British Isles. So he wasn't a man of military genius or moral backbone or even consistent principle. It is said that idols have feet of clay, and seldom was that truer than in relation to this gentleman. So he was a wartime leader, and that's how he's best known. It's astonishing to speak to adolescents in the United Kingdom, some of whom are doing GCSE history. That's a general certificate of secondary education, an exam you do when you're about 16. And sometimes I've heard the name, but they might realise he was something in relation to the Second World War, think he was a general, or don't realise this Prime Minister. He often had himself pictured in military uniform at the time, even though he didn't have any active rank at that stage. So he is so frequently depicted as the embodiment of the bulldog spirit, as though he had this indomitable will, and it throws out a challenge to us all to live up to Churchill. So let me see. He certainly had determination, and it was his iron will sustained the United Kingdom in the Second World War when wiser counsel said, let's throw in the towel. So people tried to be worthy of him. Anyway, his rotund face graces the £5 note. Churchill himself was fond of self-deprecating humour, which I think really humanises the man as a very healthy thing. And he said that all babies look like me. So Winston is often described as though he's the knight in shining armour. He's like a latter-day St. George, ever ready to slay the dragon of Nazism. So WLS Churchill, is often treated as though he's something more than human, but he is very much immortal, and us less immortals don't need to be awestruck by him as though he's a colossal figure. Now, he seems to bestride the mid-20th century in the British Isles as a colossus, and indeed, well, seen as a messiah in the early 1940s. Yes, he was very dominant. Obviously, he led the Conservative Party from 1940 to 1955. The only person who in recent times has managed that is Margaret Thatcher. And there's the other thing is people are quite nostalgic in the United Kingdom, remembering that was the last time the United Kingdom was a superpower. It then ceased to be one, to a large extent owing to Mr. Churchill himself. But this supposed saviour of liberty is a much more flawed and complex figure than many of his numerous partisans will allow. And I think we ought to face up to his debilities, to his shortcomings, and to how he undermined the very institutions that a conservative ought to treasure. So any protagonist in political controversies ought to be approached in a spirit of skeptical inquiry. I think, yeah, we've got to take him down off the pedestal and just see him as another politician who was sometimes less than honest, a man who had his weaknesses. Okay, he's a hero, and they say the greater the hero, the greater the heroic flaw. Well, indeed, this would be apt for Churchill himself. So Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill was born in November 1874 in Blenheim Palace, which is about 8 miles north of Oxford. He was a premature baby because, well, he was born about 8 months after his parents married. They'd met at Cowes Week, August. Was it the no, I can't remember the previous year, but they got married. In I suppose it would have been March 1874. So did Lord Randolph Churchill, Winston's father, press his suit before the wedding or not? We don't know, or maybe just Churchill was premature. So his wife, she is, well, Jenny Jerome was her maiden name, this American heiress. She suddenly felt her waters breaking or whatever contractions, had to go into a side room and then delivered. So Churchill was the scion of the Duke of Marlborough, okay, scion of a noble house. So he's not exactly a poster boy for equal opportunities these days, very much born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He had superb establishment connections, and he wasn't shy about using them. He would definitely pull strings and drop names to advance himself. Anyway, he was from a cadet branch of this family, the Marlborough family, so he didn't inherit the title, nor did his father. So when that Duke of Marlborough died, it went to Winston Churchill's uncle. When Winston's uncle died, it went to Winston Churchill's cousin. Okay, because Winston Churchill's father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was the youngest son of that Duke of Marlborough. Anyway, he never did inherit a dukedom and declined one later when it was supposedly offered to him. So his ancestors had lived in Wiltshire for centuries. They'd been gentry, and in the English Civil War, they'd fought for obscurantism and absolutism, for Charles I for his deeply unpopular policies, for more or less the divine right of kings against parliamentary government. So now, obviously, Churchill's not responsible for that. That was 200 years before he was born. Well, more than. The Churchill family had been cavaliers in the English Civil War, royalists, you could also call them. So Churchill was cavalier in the broader sense, sort of reckless and so on. A bit of a playboy. I know you might say serious, he wrote loads of books, he was physically courageous, that's true, but in some ways deeply unserious, and politics was just a sport to him. So anyway, his most distinguished ancestor was Sir John Churchill, who'd been an army officer who defended James II against his nephew, James II's nephew, the Duke of Monmouth, in 1685, won the Battle of Sedgemoor, brought the Duke of Monmouth back in chains, who was then executed on the order of his uncle. However, only 3 years later, Sir John Churchill turned his coat, along with almost everybody else in the English establishment, and overthrew King James II for being a Roman Catholic. Now, again, none of this is something that Churchill's answerable for, because this is long before he was born, but he didn't have to defend his ancestors' reputation. You could say, yeah, my ancestors did this, and it was a bad thing to do, all right? But, or you might think it was a good thing to do. But you can't really be before and against James II. They can't both be good things to do. But anyway, he took the most intense interest in his forebearers and tried to live up to them, achieve such astonishing feats as they did. So he was forever dining out on the manly virtues and these deeds of daring do, which were wrought by other people who held that glorious name Churchill. So he was a shameless name dropper, as I already said, and he ought to be recognised that other bearers of the Churchill name were not always honourable and moral. He was a little bit binary, but sometimes couldn't quite make up his mind. Well, another thing, just in case I forget to mention it later, as it strikes me now, don't know why it's going through the synapses, but this curious coincidence, I suppose, that the moment when Britain was saved, was really saved, was Dunkirk, which of course means Church Hill, that town in the extreme north of France, right at the border with Belgium. And that was just after he became Prime Minister, when if sort of 250,000 British troops hadn't been evacuated, that would have severely weakened the UK, when more likely to come to terms with the Third Reich. So Churchill, he was a man of attainments, and yes, he had talents in abundance. He is rightly adulated for his oratorical ability, his many magnificent tomes, his formidable agility at political manoeuvring, and his fencing prowess. Indeed, he was a schoolboy fencing champion for the public schools, as that means fee-paying schools in the United Kingdom. He won a declamation prize. He committed to memory the whole of the Lays of Ancient Rome by Thomas Babington Macaulay. Oh, how can man die better than facing fearful odds for the ashes of his fathers and the temples of his gods? So very few people these days would dip into those verses. So, but once in a while, it is healthy to read a corrective of so much of the excessively glowing coverage of Churchill, much of which is pap. So those who take up cudgels for Churchill are invariably take up cudgels or against him are invariably left wingers. Therefore, I think it's instructive for once just to come across a conservative who is willing to seriously criticise Churchill. But none of this is supposed to rehabilitate his enemies. Just because his enemies were ogres, and they were, that doesn't necessarily mean that he was sagacious, that he was morally upstanding, or any of the rest of it. As I earlier indicated, monarchy, fair trials, freedom of speech, free trade, personal autonomy, national sovereignty for the free market, property rights, low taxation, capitalism, and so on. These are the values that a conservative is supposed to cherish, yet Winston did so much to undermine them. So what drove him appears to be grandiosity. He certainly wanted to carve out a name for himself, and he succeeded fabulously. I don't think anyone could doubt that. He was a great PR man, an indefatigable self-promoter, such that his name will echo down the centuries. I mean, you ask someone now to name one British Prime Minister of the 20th century, probably Churchill's the most likely to come up. After that, maybe Thatcher, and people are not very well clued up in British politics. They would be hard pressed to name any others. So he's just an image for people. He went to Harrow School, as I pointed out, the dump of the hump, as Tonians like to call it. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, had been to Eton, loathed it, so Winston went to Harrow. He detested it, so his son Randolph went to Eton. Notice how in the generations they've gone this Randolph Winston, Randolph Winston, Randolph Winston, right down to today. Anyway, so the boys at Harrow School had to process in alphabetical order. Now, Winston Churchill, he's Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill, had a double-barrel surname, Spencer Churchill. Princess Diana was a distant collateral descendant. So Churchill didn't like having this double-barrel surname, Spencer Churchill, put him too far down the alphabet, so he dropped the Spencer, he'll be Winston Churchill. Never trust a man who can't even tell the truth about his own name. But what else? That's why he's often known as Winston S. Churchill for much of his career, because his contemporary was an American novelist named Winston Churchill, and he was, in the early days, far better known than the British politician. So to avoid confusion, that's why the British politician was Winston S. Churchill for a long time. Anyway, so when he was 22, bad things happened. The woman he was close to, his nanny, Mrs. Everest, she died. Womany, as he called her, he rushed to her bedside, he paid for a funeral, all the rest of it. Very touching chapter in Winston Boris Johnson's biography of Churchill. It came out about 3 years ago. What else about them? And also his father died, who died of syphilis, and that was very problematic for him. He was going mentally ill towards the end. Churchill had one younger brother, Jack, about 6 years younger, who wasn't very close to, became a stockbroker. Jack's daughter, Clarissa, married Sir Anthony Eden, the conservative who succeeded Churchill as Prime Minister. What else about Winston? So wasn't very bright, struggled at the classics and so on. And obviously education was so much was about Latin and ancient Greek in those days. Now there's no doubt about his ratiocination, but he could only do that in English. He was useless at foreign languages, like at French. They famously said, someone said, "Can anybody here speak French?" And Churchill put his hand up and said, "Je." Or Anthony Eden later said, "I had to translate Winston's French into French." And he had gone on a tour of Switzerland with a tutor. he and his brother in the Berner Oberland, and there's a colourful scene in My Early Life by Churchill about when they were in some boat in a lake and they got out of the boat and they're swimming, and then the wind got up and the boat was going further away from them. They were very far from the shore. They couldn't swim that well. Could they get back to the boat? Or were they going to be exhausted? Well, they managed, obviously. Otherwise, they might have drowned. Anyway, so he wanted to join the British Army, and he got into Sandhurst, the Royal Military Academy, and then he passed out. He was a cavalry officer that was meant to be for dimwits, and he was sent out to India, the jewel in the crown. So I think one of the things that's crucial to understand about him is he was growing up at the zenith of the British Empire, and that was his mindset. So much of his outlook was generational, was not personal, which is why in the 1950s he found it very difficult to face up to the new reality that the United Kingdom was living in very diminished circumstances, and he brought that about. So he arrived completely incurious about India, and he'd already convinced himself that India had absolutely nothing to teach him. So he was very closed-minded, and this chauvinistic attitude reflects badly on him. In fact, it's contemptible. Anyway, whilst in Hindustan, he read very extensively, and he was trying to make up his mind about politics. He was about 20 at this stage. Up until that mind, he hadn't been terribly political. And the two parties in the United Kingdom were the Liberals and the Conservative Party. The Labour Party didn't exist as a party as such. It was the Labour Representation Committee. It was a faction within the Labour Party. There are no other parties of any significance at the time. I suppose the Home Rule Party, but that was only for Ireland, not the UK as a whole. Remembering at the time that the whole of Ireland was in the UK. Another thing I should mention is his grandfather had been briefly Viceroy of Ireland, as in the Queen's understudy in Ireland. And his father had been the Under Secretary of State for Ireland, and they lived in Phoenix Park, Dublin. And he'd known a civil servant, Mr. Thomas Burke, and when he was a toddler, he really liked this kindly Mr. Burke. They left, and he was horrified a couple of years later, Churchill, to discover that this adorable man had been murdered by the Fenians, as in the Irish Republican Brotherhood, this ultra-nationalist, what would I say, xenophobic terrorist organization. So, but Churchill was distraught, and the man they'd killed was a Catholic indeed, just because he was a civil servant, as well as Lord Frederick Cavendish, who was an Englishman who went to Ireland. I can't remember, was he going to be Secretary of State for Ireland as well, I think, but who was a Liberal politician. But anyway, and Churchill, one thing that Mrs. Everest, well, she was very keen on ramming home 2 points to him: the inherent superiority of the people of Kent, her home county. Maybe that's who bought a house there, Chartwell. And the other one was that Catholicism was wicked, and that the Fenians had something to do with it, and high church tendencies in the Church of England must be firmly resisted. Well, he wasn't particularly into that, but Churchill, he didn't like the Irish Home Rule Party, not in the early days. Well, some of his book, My Early Life, he talks about the Irish in Parliament, but meaning the Home Rule Party, because the Home Rule Party sometimes called itself the Irish Party, or else the Irish Parliamentary Party, because they were in Parliament, but I suppose also because they wanted to establish a Parliament in Dublin, and that would govern our affairs within the United Kingdom. That was the idea. We'd have devolution, but still be in the UK, analogous to Scotland's position within the UK today. Anyway, so Churchill was trying to figure himself out politically around the age of 20, and he decided that he was in every sense a liberal. However, his background was Tory par excellence, and therefore it made sense for him to join the Conservative Party, and indeed that he did, because of these impeccable Conservative credentials. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, had been Conservative peer, as I said, and indeed was Chancellor of the Exchequer, and tried to bring down the Conservative PM to become Prime Minister himself, but it didn't work. He died in his mid-40s. So, do you remember some of Churchill's famous sayings? Yes, a great many of them. I've taken more out of alcohol than alcohol's taken out of me. Or when we became Prime Minister, I have nothing to offer but blood, toils, tears, and sweat. Or something which is very apt in relation to Donald Trump: you can fool some of the people all the time. And that's true. Some people will always believe Trump. But I'll go on to finish that maxim of Churchill's. You can fool all of the people some of the time, but you can't fool all of the people all of the time. There's so many bon mots by Winston S. So incidentally, it was whilst in the subcontinent as a youth that Winston served in the Malakand Field Force in the northwest frontier. It's now the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa of Pakistan. And he wrote an account of his campaign there, and he made some exceptionally disobliging comments about our Mohammedan brethren, and these are seized upon with relish by American Islamophobes to this day. And he exposed himself to fire when there's no military rationale for so doing. So there can be no doubt about his physical courage. He was almost suicidally brave, because he said he sought to command troops in future in himself, and therefore he ought to build up a reputation for courage. So yes, he had this self-destruct tendency. You're going to a pupillage fair on Saturday down in London until Tuesday. Must-see places you'd recommend perhaps the average tourist would not be aware of. Great content. Well, that's so much to talk about, and it's kind of rather interrupting my video now. Why do you direct message me? I'm sure you want to hire me as your tour guide. So where were we? Anyway, so he left South Asia after only a couple of years. He always remembered his servant there and sent the chap a pension for the rest of his life, which he was under no legal obligation to do. He couldn't understand the Irish as they refused to be English, RJ's bar humbug. Well, okay, well, I know, but we're not English, and I don't think anybody said that we are English, just like the English aren't Irish. But I mean, we're all virtually the same. Let's not split hairs here. In Ireland, almost all of us have got some English ancestry. In England, quite a few people have got Irish ancestry. So we're completely jumbled around these British Isles. So it's really the narcissism of small differences, taking a trifling difference and inflating it hugely. But we're almost identical. But there we are. Even like a landscape or a street scene, often you couldn't tell whether it was in Ireland or England unless you really went in close and you could see the street signs. It was something that Churchill said, oh, was it? Okay. Yeah, was it from part of his history of the English-speaking peoples or something like that? But we started to speak English, and we adopted some aspects of English culture. Cultures change, all right? Adapting some foreign culture doesn't do a bad thing. Yeah, Edmund Burke said you can be both English and Irish, indeed, because he was Irish, he was open about that, he described himself to his electors in Bristol as a true Englishman. This came before Gaelic nationalism, and especially coming from Dublin, the most anglicised city in Ireland, it was like that. He was completely Anglophone. I don't believe he could speak a word of Irish. Now, his mother's from Cork, a Catholic, and I don't know if she spoke Irish, and she wasn't from Cork City, she's from rural Cork, and so that's that. And obviously Burke is a Norman surname, so it can be an English Norman well as an Irish Norman surname. Anyway, so Churchill, he was a shameless, showboating charlatan, opportunist, jingoist, warmonger. No wonder that Boris Johnson perceives him as a role model. But you can say, if you say that you're a conservative, people will instantly assume that you must automatically be a fan of Winston Churchill. But a true conservative would be driven by the common good, acting for that, and wishing to uphold conservative nostra, striving for the furtherance of the principles I outlined earlier. Churchill was an F.E. Smith wannabe. Well, kind of. And I filmed outside F.E. Smith's house, the Earl of Birkenhead. Well, not quite, because F.E. Smith was cerebral. Churchill was not. Although, I mean, he only published loads of books. The only thing is he did have ghost writers. How much of those did he really write? He certainly had researchers to help them, because he produced a staggering amount of text, published not more words than Shakespeare and Dickens combined. Now, I know he lived a lot longer. He lived to the age of 90. And he was a gentleman of leisure, okay, because, you know, Shakespeare didn't start out with that much money. He started out, middle class and had to work. Obviously, just hardly anything got printed. Printing had been invented not that long before Shakespeare's time. Wasn't it said Nicholas Soames was as great as his grandfather? He is a rather dull chap. Nicholas Soames, the Honourable Nicholas Soames, he stole the land reforms from Zimbabwe, I believe, Torrance system. New Zealand, I believe. Oh, sorry. Who's Nicholas Soames stole the land reform from New Zealand? I am not sure what you're talking about. Okay, Nicholas Soames is Churchill's grandson via his daughter Mary, the Honourable Nicholas Soames. You should say borrowed, because Mary Churchill married Mr. Soames, who became Lord Soames, the last governor of Zimbabwe Rhodesia, blah, blah, blah. So Nicholas Soames, he was born in 1948. He went to Eton and Sandhurst, an army officer, cavalry regiment. He was an equerry to the Prince of Wales, they're close friends to this day. Nicholas Soames is a Conservative MP for Sussex Mid, one of the longest serving ones, a Remainer. I've met him, who's enormously obese. It used to be said there were some things in British politics which go without saying. Alan Clark has something to outrage the left. John Prescott has mangled a sentence. Or Nicholas Soames has just enjoyed a rather large luncheon. And I remember 20 years ago, a bon mot of Soames getting into the Telegraph, the Peterborough column. This would terminate your career these days. What do you say to a woman with two black eyes? Nothing. You've told it twice already. Perhaps he's not a feminist. Anyway, back to Winston Churchill. So he was a rat. Who called him that? Churchill called himself a rat. So this soi-disant conservative started out as a conservative, then ratted, again his own word, to the Liberals before re-ratting. Once again, it's his own choice of word to the Liberals, from the Liberals back to the Conservatives in 1922, where he briefly tried to stand as a constitutionalist on his own, described himself as an anti-sosh free trader, as an anti-socialist. It's doubtful that Churchill was ever a conservative with a capital C or a small c, or ever anything else, liberal, capital L, or lowercase l, whatever. Libertarian, socialist. You're laughing, straight white British Protestants laughing out loud. So the Conservative Party was a vehicle for his own advancement. Didn't like political juggernauts, really. It was in the blood. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, had invented the concept of Tory democracy. Asked to define it, Lord Randolph had said, opportunism, mostly. Well, the only thing wrong with that is the word mostly. Because, the Conservatives then were agreeing to an extension of the franchise greater than the one they had vehemently opposed only a couple of years earlier. And then it came to Home Rule for Ireland. In Lord Randolph Churchill's private correspondence, he said, please God, it will turn out to be the ace and not the two, as in cards. So he was doing it solely for partisan advantage, trying to maximize their electoral gain was to do with that sort of calculation, not out of any principle. He was bereft of sincerity. He thought this would redound to his advantage. So Winston likewise would do things not really because he believed or disbelieved in anything. So Winston was a chip off the old block in that regard. He'd craved his father's approval. Would he do a rant on George Galloway? That's a good idea, actually. Perhaps I will do. Galloway's met me actually once years ago. So Churchill would do and say anything to speed his way along the cursus honorum. Anyway, so other things. I'm not going to go through his whole career, but he left the army. He was a war correspondent in Cuba. Couldn't decide whether he supported the Spanish government or the Cuban rebels. And then he went to South Africa, 1899. The Second South African War erupted. The Tweede Vryheidsoorlog, as the Afrikaners called it, when the British Empire was attacked by the Transvaal Republic and the Orange Free State, despite the fact that the Oranje Vrystaat had accepted British paramountcy. They were really under the suzerainty of the Queen. So Churchill, as I pointed out, he later joined the Liberals, 1904, and he said he later kicked himself for doing so. He rued crossing the floor because had he stayed at the Tories a few more years, he would then have become their leader, according to himself. Now, his putative reason for becoming a Liberal was that he was horrified by tariff reform, although curiously enough, that became Conservative policy in the late 1920s. And who was one of the most outspoken advocates of such a policy? It was a certain Winston Churchill. And having said that, okay, people can change their minds, especially in over 20 years. It's completely honourable to do so. Was it John Stuart Mill said, when I realise I'm wrong, I change my mind. What do you do, sir? Or who was it said, when the facts change, I change my mind. In different circumstances, a different policy is right. So it can be meet and wise to change your mind. So go back to the Boer War, as we usually call it. So during that time, Churchill was there, and was he a soldier masquerading as a journalist or whatever? Make up your mind. You can't have the best of both worlds. So he was captured. Now, nobody thinks that reflects any discredit on him. He was held in a school building as a prisoner of war. Apparently, the Boers considered executing him, but then they said, okay, actually, he escaped. If we hadn't escaped, we're actually about to release him as a war correspondent. And did he bilk his friend who was due to be part of the escape plan? But anyway, he got all the way to Lourenço Marques, as in the Portuguese Southeast Africa. So it was a much needed fillip for British morale. The UK needed that tonic because of Black Week, 3 defeats in 1 week, and morale was flagging. Anyway, but during that South African War, David Lloyd George, this liberal MP for Carnarvon Boroughs, he denounced governmental policy, saying that methods of barbarism was being used by interning enemy civilians and so on. But Lloyd George was widely regarded as a Judas by many conservatives. When he went to address a rally in Birmingham, he had to escape in a police uniform lest he be ripped apart by a baying Tory mob. So he thought that the UK was wrong to fight the Transvaal Republic and the Orange Free State, who declared war on the UK unprovoked. Anyway, only a few years later, Churchill was bosom buddies with Lloyd George and on the Liberal front bench with him. All right, in Churchill's defence, it could be said that was magnanimous and broad-minded of him. You kiss and make up. Okay, politics make strange bedfellows. You can forgive people and you move forward and don't bear grudges. Anyway, so he absolved him for his pro-Boer attitude. Would Churchill win an election today? That's a good question. Well, he was a great communicator. It's hard to know how he'd kind of, to go down in a television age. Because remember when he stood down as Prime Minister in 1955, BBC television had not been going very long. Very few people had televisions. Only for the coronation of 1953 did some people buy them. They were still mega expensive. There wasn't this 24-hour media cycle. Admittedly, he was very old by then, had a stroke. But I don't know if he would have adjusted to the medium. He would certainly adjust his policies. But he was perhaps too militaristic, too old school. Even in relation to his time, even in relation to his youth. Was he a bit of a young fogey in some ways? Perhaps. So Churchill was a functioning alcoholic. Now, that's not a moral judgment. I've got nothing against people being alcoholics. I'm friends with some alcoholics. Doesn't bother me. I couldn't care two hoots if you got drunk out of your tiny little gourd every night. A righteous person can be a dipsomaniac. It doesn't have to be harming anybody else. Why would you want to die healthy? You might as well enjoy your body before you die and have your liver buried separately with full military honours. So Churchill never got drunk, but then again he never got sober. He drank steadily through the whole day. So that's the way he liked to booze. But his alcohol dependency makes him a problematic icon for conservatives of a puritanical bent. And some conservatives, particularly in the United States, are of that sort of cast of mind, judgmental, moralistic, especially when it comes to imbibing spirituous liquor. Anyway, Churchill, he held various posts in the Liberal cabinet. He was quite a scout for them. He could appeal to other people, and there was a sense that he was a rat off a sinking ship. If he was deserting the Tories, that's because he had a very strong hunch that the Conservative Party was going to get whacked in the next election, and indeed they get their bum thrashed in 1906. He made it to booze 90 in all. Well, alcohol preserves genetic material. But Churchill, he had held various posts, including Home Secretary, and sending the troops into Tony Pandy. Now, this is an issue which has separated in Wales for decades. It was brought up in the 70s briefly. I can't remember who was saying something about this back then. You're bitter up against Churchill. You have a feud against my family because of that. But that's why that speaker, is it Tommy Twice, George Thomas, the Speaker of the House of Commons, chose to be ennobled as Lord Tony Pandy. But nobody was killed by the troops. This is a common misapprehension. But it was the death knell of the trades union support for the Liberal Party when he did that. Up until them, it was between them and the Labour Party to be the party of the trades unions. But let us clear out of the way any notion there was a massacre at Tony Pandy. There certainly was not. But some of the accusations that are levelled against him are preposterous and false. There was a Sydney Street siege incident in the East End of London when he's Home Secretary, when Peter the Painter and some, I think it was Lithuanian anarchists, he'd robbed a bank and killed some people. They were cornered in a flat. There was a bit of a shootout. Eventually it caught fire. He told the fire brigade not to put it out. He went along there wearing his topper, carrying a shotgun. People said, was he just keen to take a photo opportunity? He was a glory boy and an exhibitionist. So it's a bit like his penchant for showing himself naked to other men. I don't think it was someone of homosexual propensities. It wouldn't bother me if it was. Indeed, someone said that he was, and he sued them for libel successfully just after the turn of the 20th century. Anyway, so Churchill, he opposed Home Rule for Ireland when his first few years of his career in the House of Commons. Then he changed his mind on that one, and he spoke up for it. He even went to Belfast to address a Home Rule rally at what I think is now as Casement Park, which is a Gaelic Athletics Association stadium, which I think probably a lot of GAA people wouldn't be terribly pleased about if they knew that one. And they say a loyalist mob tried to tip his car into the River Lagan, and but for his presence, the presence of his wife, they would have done so, would have been drowned. So, as I say, it can be completely laudable to change your mind. Very few people have exactly the same opinions all the way through their life. But I suspect that Churchill was only doing so for electoral gain, and it would seem to be a sort of liberal shibboleth that this should be done. Actually, it's probably right, even though I'm against Home Rule retrospectively, as most people wanted it. I suppose the sensible thing is to grant it, and maybe it would have saved a lot of grief later on. Anyway, so eugenics is now almost universally regarded with horror, but Churchill was a stalwart advocate for this. And there were a great many people of various different points of view who concurred with him. It's an opinion that would now disturb pro-lifers, but that's it. So in 1914, the Liberal cabinet met to discuss the situation in Europe in the wake of the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo by Gavrilo Princip. So German troops were poised to invade Belgium. And a couple of weeks earlier, the cabinet memorandum had said, if there is to be a European war, happily it's an event in which will be no more than spectators. The Prime Minister at the time was Henry Herbert Asquith. So H.H. Asquith and the others were convinced that the United Kingdom could, and indeed should, stand aloof from the conflagration that was sure to engulf Europe. These were going to be a major war, a clash of the titans, in which at least hundreds of thousands of troops were going to be killed, even if it was all over by Christmas. But Churchill and a couple of others, they cajoled people to go to war. Hello, Regina, I want my own TV show. Thank you so much. We'll speak to television executives about me. I need to be discovered. And the other thing is, please subscribe to me. I teach people online, so I'm sure you want online lessons in history, English literature, French, whatever else, philology, politics and government, religious studies, things of that nature. I teach people for GCSEs, A-level, IB, 13 plus, 11 plus exams here in the United Kingdom, and I'm a tour guide in London. Anyway, thank you so much for the donations, everybody. Churchill and a couple of others, they coaxed the cabinet into saying that war must be declared on Deutschland for invading Belgium, all pursuant to the Treaty of London, 1839. So it speaks volumes about Churchill's extraordinary powers of suasion, that he was able to win over so many much more seasoned politicians against their better judgments, but the repercussions of that are still with us today. So the United Kingdom, for a century prior to that, had taken care to choose its enemies wisely, only to fight against countries over which the United Kingdom had a considerable technological edge. But a war against the greatest industrial power in Europe was a very serious undertaking indeed. So even Germany's worst enemies would agree that Germany was no pushover. It was not easy to defeat them. However much, even if you were an anti-German bigot, you would not say that they were feeble. Okay, they were a very tough enemy and had superb military technology, much more efficient industry than the British Isles. So this war was always going to be very bloody, even if it had been over by Christmas. Well, it was over by Christmas, but not 1914, 1918. So Churchill considered himself something of a military expert, obviously been in the army for only a few years, then the Oxfordshire Hussars, like, yeomanry, that's part-time army. But he ought to have known from the American Civil War and the South African War that technology was prolonging war, not foreshortening it. There was this idea that it sped it up and it would be over quicker, but that wasn't the case. Anyway, even if it had been over by Christmas that year, at least 2 million people were killed by that time. Now, it's true that Churchill didn't start the war. He didn't assassinate the Archduke. He didn't declare war on Serbia or war on anybody else like that. And so the war was already going, but he got the British Empire in it when the British Empire could have stayed out of it. So the Second Reich could have heeded Britain's warning not to invade Belgium, but they pressed ahead heedless of that. They said, well, the British aren't serious, they're probably bluffing, but even if they do declare war, well, don't worry, we'll defeat France by then. Did Belgium matter? Well, I suppose the idea is then the Germans could occupy ports very close to Belgium, saying to the Belgians, give us safe passage, we have thoroughfare through your country to fight France, but obviously Belgians don't want to do that, don't want the German army coming in, and the Germans promised to withdraw once the war is over. How do we know they're going to honour that promise? They haven't respected our sovereignty so far. And if they don't honour the promise, what can we do about it? We're not strong enough to fight them on our own. Nobody will be around to come to our aid because France will have been smashed. And what if France wins? They'll be irate with us. They'll punish us for having let the Germans through. But possibly a mistake on the part of the Belgians. You fast forward to the Second World War. King Albert III, who can disagree with him, the King of the Belgians, decided to wave the white flag, saying he couldn't put his people through such agony again. And if only they'd done that in 1914, France would have been swiftly defeated, the war would have been over, Germany might have withdrawn, even if they hadn't, hundreds of thousands of Belgian lives would have been saved. Baby Belgium. Anyway, so was Belgium's independence worth the lives of 2 million people killed in 1914? Well, only 4 million people lived in Belgium. Should 2 million people die to keep 4 million people independent? I say absolutely not. I'm not a pacifist. There are things which are worth more than human life. Okay, the independence of Belgium is not independent anymore. Depends what it's joining. If they were treated like Germans, not that bad. Germany had an extensive welfare system. A lot of men got to vote in those days. Admittedly, they had the three-class voting system. It was slanted towards the affluent. They didn't have that much freedom of expression, but okay, it wasn't that oppressive. It wasn't the worst country in Europe, not by a long shot. But to keep those 4 million independent, would it be worth 2 people dying? Definitely. 200? Yes. 2,000? Probably. 20,000? Probably not. 200,000? Definitely not. 2 million? Absolutely no way. Anyway, many countries have been invaded and Britain hadn't declared war, and indeed the UK had sometimes conquered other countries. So the subjugation of Belgium, I don't understand why that's so categorically different, but I suppose it's close to Britain's shore. Anyway, so the UK had sometimes broken treaties, and other countries had been in breach of treaties and nothing had been done. Why was it the Treaty of London was sacred and none of the others were? But I remember one of my teachers, Dr. Gailey, Prince William's housemaster, saying it's merely a matter of parliamentary democracy. Right, the UK did not fight to try and bring democracy to Germany. All right, who said that was a war aim? Actually, Germany did become a democracy after the war, although it didn't last that long. And the UK wasn't completely democratic because, about a quarter of men didn't have the right to vote in 1914 if they'd changed addresses within the last year, or there were lodges or something, they didn't have the right to vote. No women had the right to vote. So it's nothing to do with that. And the Second Reich never said, oh, we want to interfere with Britain's political system. They didn't want to fight the UK at all. There we are. So much bunkum is talked about this. People say they're really alternative motives. The ostensible reason is drivel. But anyway, Churchill was First Lord of the Admiralty by the time that the war broke out. So it was his responsibility to see that the United Kingdom was more than a match for the German Navy. Remember, there was double-powered standard. There was the Naval Defence Act of the 1880s saying that the Royal Navy must be as large as the second and the third largest navies in the world put together. And the idea was if they teamed up against the United Kingdom, the Royal Navy would be large enough to defeat them. Why not as big as the second, the third, and the fourth put together? Well, you've got to draw the limit somewhere, and then fiscal policy was such that the UK simply wasn't going to pay for that. Now, the German Navy scored some early victories against the Royal Navy, the Battle of Dogger Bank and the Battle of Coronel, and that was obviously deeply disquieting for Britishers. As Churchill said about, who was it? Was it Lord Beatty or one of the Royal Naval Admirals? I think it's Jellicoe. He was the only man who could lose the war in an afternoon. And I thought, oh my goodness, that means he's saying the bloke was completely an incompetent and utter klutz. No. He was highly competent, but there's always a bit of a wild card factor. If he's unlucky, it would be game over for the United Kingdom. Okay, and so the Germans then started to build more U-boats, and so much of Britain's merchant fleet was sent to Davy Jones's locker. But if there was a naval battle in which a serious number of British ships were sent to the bottom, then the UK would not be able to protect its trade, and that would be the end of the war, because the UK imported 2/3 of its food and produced only 1/3 of its food in 1914. Obviously, it was then more difficult to import it. When the war broke out, enemy countries weren't going to sell it. Neutral countries were going to charge more to transport it. The UK had to try and produce more of its own food. That's difficult when some of the farmers have gone to war and the horses have gone to war. Remember, horses were used for transport a lot in the war, not for actually fighting, because of machine guns and barbed wire. You transport things by train. There weren't very many cars or trucks. Roads were without tarmac in those days. To get things from the railway station to wherever a few miles away, put on a horse-drawn carriage. So horses taken off. Fertilizer factories were making explosives because it's based on nitrates and blah, blah, blah. So it's a lot more difficult to produce food. That's why there was rationing. And obviously that goes against conservatism, interference with the free market, but they had to do it. But that was a jettisoning a conservative principle because of the war. And so had it not been for the war, they wouldn't have had to do that. Anyway, so uh, so the UK started to blockade Germany at the beginning, and that was before Germany did that to the United Kingdom. The Germans were simply retaliating. So the United Kingdom declared all goods, well, almost all goods, for contraband of war, including foodstuffs, which apparently weren't allowed to do. Now that is morally questionable, to say the least. But American ships, the United States was still neutral, sailing to Germany. The Royal Navy would stop them, and the United States would complain. What about freedom of navigation? The seas ought to be free. And the UK was very reluctant to antagonize the United States. It was crucial. Therefore, it would often sometimes simply buy all the cargo at market price. The Americans were happy they could sail home. They had a shorter journey. They made their money. And obviously the Germans hadn't got their goods. But anyway, then there was the Dardanelles campaign, which is Churchill's brainchild. I know he said that wars are either won by manoeuvre or slaughter, but if we can have more manoeuvre, we can have less slaughter. Now, the Royal Navy had thrice investigated the possibility of forcing the Straits. That's this narrow stretch of water in Turkey, in between the Aegean Sea and the Black Sea. Now, twice the Royal Navy concluded it was impossible to do so, and once it concluded it was possible, but at a very high cost. The conclusion said, yeah, we can do it. It'll be difficult. It's not certain we succeed, but it's not impossible. And there'll be very high casualties. We'll lose a lot of capital ships. So mindlessly as optimistic as ever, Churchill insisted on ploughing ahead. Now, we all know of the calamitous consequences. All right, it's not quite as cataclysmic as people sometimes paint it, because the Ottomans suffered more casualties than the Allies. The Ottomans could ill afford to sustain those casualties, considering they're outnumbered by the Allies. The Ottoman Empire was a Middle Eastern empire based around Turkey. What's now Turkey, Syria, Palestine, Israel, Iraq, Jordan, parts of Saudi Arabia. Anyway, but even if it had succeeded, the Allies had sailed through to Constantinople, as we then called it, Istanbul, seized control of the Dardanelles, being able to bombard the Ottoman capital. That wouldn't necessarily have knocked the Ottomans out of the war. Turkey is a large country. It's got its mountain fastness. It's perhaps some of the most defensible topography in Europe, maybe even more so than Switzerland. They could defend these narrow mountain passes, and it wouldn't have assisted Russia very much. One of the ideas was to keep Russia in the war to ship weapons or reinforcements to them. So Lloyd George had talked about knocking away the props from Germany. People say not really. It's just really a wasted effort, diffusing your effort. It's a sideshow. The war is going to be won or lost on the Western Front, and it's really squandering resources. Notably, Churchill's crony Ian Hamilton was in charge of the battle there of Gallipoli, and indeed he got killed in the battle. Caused a lot of bitterness in Australia and New Zealand, strained Commonwealth relations. They felt that their lives were thrown away in this completely fatuous campaign. There were futile attacks against heavily defended positions. People knew that these attacks couldn't possibly succeed. That's the argument. I don't think it's completely true. So anyway, the death toll caused many people to blanch during the war. Even stout-hearted soldiers asked, is there not a better way forward? I can't remember who had this letter published, some aristocrat. Can we really afford to go on paying this sort of cost for this sort of gain, as in, thousands of men killed to go forward a mile? And at this rate, the British nation would be extinct before they got to Berlin. So some people put out peace feelers to the Central Powers, their back channels. Can we negotiate? Don't have to win or lose, call it a draw, go back to status quo ante. But Churchill was having none of it. He set his face against this, just like in South Africa. His attitude was to fight to the finish. Okay, so that shows this steely self-will. But this iron determination, is this not just pig-headedness? If it saved lives, that's fine. And also, the Allies fight on. You're not sure the Allies are going to win. Even if they do win, it might not be worth it. It might not be so decisive. But anyway, protracted the war led to more deaths. And obviously there was intransigence on the other side. There were other people who were also obdurate in Germany, as well as on the Allied side. December 1916, the Reichstag, as a German parliament, voted to make peace with the Allies on the basis of a draw. And by July 1917, they said the war situation is so desperate, the suffering is so horrific at home, with semi-starvation at home, so many hundreds of thousands of men have been killed. Make peace now. no matter what the cost is. Lose, fine, surrender, we don't care. We cannot go on bearing the suffering. Hello there, Ben Perryman. So, so stringing out this war led to the October Revolution in Russia. That was therefore the advent of communism, which is the bugbear of the remainder of Churchill's life. If peace had negotiated in 1916, there would have been no Stalin, no Churchill, no Hitler, no Second World War, no Cold War. Tens of millions of lives would have been saved. Now, all right, this counterfactual history game is not entirely fair because in between 1916 and, say, 1939, anything else could have caused a major war. We don't know. But Niall Ferguson says this: supposing Germany had won in 1916, there would have been a better outcome, something like the European Union. Look at Germany's Mitteleuropa plan in the September programme, that discussion document they had prepared by the Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg. These weren't certain war aims, though. But anyway, supposing Germany had achieved this triumph in 1916, what would someone like Hitler have to be hacked off about? Very little, which doesn't guarantee they wouldn't then go and try to conquer even more land, because perhaps his bloodlust was insatiable. All right, so Churchill wasn't the Prime Minister during the First World War, so he can't carry the can for all these mutton-headed decisions. So look at the Irish conflict after the First World War, the first troubled times of the 20th century. The Royal Irish Constabulary was reeling because some had been bumped off by the Irish Republican Army. The RIC, that's the police in Ireland at the time, as I say, was very short on manpower. So Churchill helped form the RIC Special Reserve. They were often opprobriously known as the Black and Tans. Now, they were tasked with fighting the IRA, and they did so. This was he was a prime mover behind this. So this unit did not always behave inculpably. So sometimes there was a serious wrongdoing by this unit, but he would never denounce them. So during this troubled time in Ireland, Churchill, he fulminated against the IRA, especially one of its head honchos, one Michael Collins. But by December 1921, Churchill literally embraced Collins. I remember hearing this moving testimony on that Robert Key History of Ireland video made about 1981, and Robert Key is speaking to, what's his name, Sean McBride, who was then, my goodness, about 17. Churchill advocated the use of chemical weapons. Yeah, indeed he did in the Second World War. But going back to Sean McBride, he'd been going between Dublin and London at weekends, but carrying mails back and forth between the Sinn Féin delegation at Downing Street and the Sinn Féin administration, well, in Dublin, wasn't really ruling much of Ireland. But anyway, and he said that Churchill, it was Lloyd George, who put his hand around Collins and showed him the map of the British Empire, say, why not come in and help us run this? Because the Commonwealth really mattered. So many people of Irish blood in Australia and Canada and so forth. And then it had an impact on Collins, who seemed to think, well, perhaps somehow assisting in this might be the way forward. Anyway, so Collins was killed by his former organisation, the IRA, shot on West Cork roadside, a fate he devised for so many others, so there was a certain poetic justice to that. But I suppose the final insult for Collins as a Republican was a glowing elegy from Churchill as the gallant leader of a valiant race. Well, we are a valiant race. But Winston performed a volte-face on M. Collins as he did on so many others. So in 1918, the Russian Civil War broke out pursuant to the October Revolution, and a few British troops were dispatched to assist the white side in that, the anti-communist side. I say that, but the whites were a very amorphous, vociferous. They weren't really a united front. They were divided geographically, politically. They had radically dissimilar visions for Russia if they won. There were reactionaries, want to bring back the Tsar as an absolute monarch. There were some people who wanted him as a constitutional monarch. There were the cadets, constitutional Democrats. The Octoberists who accepted the 1905 October Manifesto as the final settlement of the Constitution. There were social revolutionaries who really had been revolutionaries to assassinate the Tsar some years earlier. And there were, Mensheviks. Okay, so Mensheviks and these SRs, they really were far left, but yet Churchill was backing them. I know there was the Bolsheviks or worse, the anarchists on the Bolshevik side, but they fell out of love with them very fast indeed. But anyway, So through the First World War, the United Kingdom and the Allied countries had shipped tons of weapons to these Russian ports in the extreme north, Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. But anyway, sometimes the ground had collapsed under the tonnage of all these boxes of weapons because the Russian transport system was breaking down. They just weren't repairing it because of the war. They didn't have enough coal or steel or men to do this work. Oh, we'll do it after the war, which is okay if the war lasts a few months. But when it's lasted 4 years, that's not viable. You have to renovate a railway as well. Anyway, so the British thought, oh my God, what have we got? They've got tons of these weapons here, could fall into red hands or even German hands because the situation was in flux there. Remember, Germany had occupied Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Finland, and much of what we call Belarus and Ukraine. Could they land troops in the far north of Russia? Quite easily, get them over there from Finland. So to remove or destroy these arms, if the Civil War would give them into white hands. Indeed, there was some prison up there, some island, run by British and whites, and obviously communist propaganda later made much of this, supposedly saying that the British were really sadistic jailers. I don't know that to be false, but I suspect it's largely exaggerated. Anyway, so London inquired of the British officers in Russia, can the whites win? What do we need to make them win? And the answer came back, I can't remember his name, Ulster's King of Karelia, a Belfast man, who went to the Royal Academic Institute in Belfast. Yes, the whites can win with British help, but only if we intervene on a large scale. We have to send hundreds of thousands of troops. We got to do this with determination. If we do that, we'll win. Otherwise, don't do it all, okay? And just typically, the British cabinet, including Churchill, responded with half measures, sending several thousand of troops, which is the worst of both worlds, enough to seriously irritate the Bolsheviks, but not enough to defeat them. So the Bolsheviks were infuriated, and it didn't change the outcome of the war. That's why the Anglican Church in Moscow, and indeed in St. Petersburg, they were seized as enemy property, because they were at war, kind of. And it took a few years before the United Kingdom recognized the Bolshevik government as the rightful government of Russia. So relations between the two were soured for generations. Okay, the Bolsheviks were never going to like the UK as this, whatever, bourgeois capitalist state, but they could at least be neutral towards it, not hostile, perceived as an enemy. Very few Britons know that the British Army invaded Russia in 1918. You can guarantee that most Russians know that. Having said that, London's argument is we were doing so at the invitation of the legitimate government of Russia, the whites. But Alexander Kerensky, the Prime Minister, had fled the United States, didn't even call himself Prime Minister anymore. It was not really clear who was in charge. So anyway, these people he proposed to assist, as I say, some of them were out-and-out reactionaries wanting to restore the Tsar with untrammeled powers, and others were ultra-left. So people would say to assassinate the Tsar. So neither polar politics should be supported by the United Kingdom. There wasn't much British interest in this, and the UK had too many of its own problems to contend with. First World War wasn't quite over. Even after Armistice Day 1918, it could have carried on. Hostilities could have broken out afresh. So had the whites most won the war, that most assuredly would have been a second conflict between left-wingers and right-wingers amongst the whites. Churchill, he often excoriated the Bolsheviks as animals and so on, said the communist state ought to be strangled in its cradle. But you might agree with him, but intervening in a foreign civil war is scarcely conservative. So Winston Churchill was a cabinet minister in 1917 when the Balfour Declaration was issued. He was a Philo-Semite, that's laudable. Lord Rothschild had been a prominent political ally of his father. So, but Churchill's Zionism does not endear him to the Palestinians who were dispossessed as a result of Churchill's belief that, well, they should just be driven off to the land and given to a more advanced race as he saw it. Anyway, this video has been going on so long, almost a record for me. I don't want to go on all because I could be here all night talking about Winston Churchill. So, what other things did he get wrong? I mean, that's still a toxic issue in the Middle East even now. The fact that the Palestinians were booted out of their homeland. Now, admittedly, at that time, people thought that the Jewish state might be a province within an Arab kingdom or something, or a dominion of the British Empire, probably maybe not a sovereign state, and there was low-level Jewish immigration that wouldn't be menacing to the autochthonous population. The Balfour Declaration said it was without prejudice to the rights of existing communities. And as you may agree, that the rights of the existing communities in Palestine have been very much prejudiced in the intervening century. So anyway, Churchill was going to be appointed to the cabinet in the mid-20s, was Stanley Baldwin, and he was waiting to go in to find out which post he was going to get, told he was going to be Chancellor. He thought, what, of the Duchy of Lancaster? These two sort of non-jobs in the cabinet, Chancellor of the Duchy of Cornwall and Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, because the Queen is Duke of Lancaster. I know she's a woman, but they don't call her Duchess of Lancaster, Duke of Lancaster. And whereas Prince Charles, he's Duke of Cornwall. There's various estates in that southwestern tip of England that are used to make an income for the Prince of Wales, like farmland they rent out and whatnot. But anyway, he became Chancellor of the Exchequer, Churchill, in the late 20s. And the UK had gone off the gold standard in the First World War. And one of the hot potatoes at the time was, should the United Kingdom go back on the gold standard or not? In those days, you go into a bank with your pound sterling and exchange it for gold, or go to a bank with gold and get cash for it. And it gave people confidence in the currency was real because it was backed by gold. Because remember, we didn't have paper money till the 17th century. People were deeply mistrustful of it, wouldn't accept it as face value. But anyway, should the United Kingdom resume the gold standard, and expert opinion urged him to do so, Churchill was sceptical about it. Anyway, he eventually was persuaded to do so, but it turned out to be a disaster, and the pound was overvalued. It kept unemployment obstinately high. There was a terrible slump through the 20s. Unemployment never fell below 10%. So, all right, he was convinced to do it by people who were thought to know better, but ultimately, you carry the can. You take responsibility. You're the cabinet minister. It is your decision. You don't have to go along with the advice. You are entitled to reject the advice. So this decision had to be reversed a few years later. So the gold standard, as I say, it was calamitous. So go back to 1919 in Glasgow, when it was convulsed by strikes. The Red Clyde, as in that's the river that flows through Glasgow, the Clyde. People call it the Red Clyde because it was a hotbed of communist agitation. James Maxton and all that. The Independent Labour Party, group outside the Labour Party. Now, Gordon Brown, Labour Prime Minister, he wrote a hagiography of James Maxton, you know, overlooking his anti-war activism and so on. Well, you might say the fight in the First World War was wrong, but all right. But Gordon Brown, he was in favour of the liberation of Iraq and Afghanistan. So was I. But this guy who was an anti-war agitator makes an odd hero for you. So Winston, he'd ordered tanks onto the street of Glasgow. You can see why the authorities were jumpy. It was a shaky moment for social unity. Many people were inspired by the Russian Revolution. Some British are saying, yeah, we should do what they did, and they were hoisting the red flag. But socialists regard this as a gross abuse of state power, bringing troops onto the streets in a bid to cow the Labour movement because they weren't trying to overthrow the government. Now, I suppose there was some hot-headed agitators and these rhetorals saying, oh, yes, we should have a revolution. But there were other people who were within the democratic tradition who were exercising their constitutional right to agitate upon public grievances and were going on strike. That's legitimate. No can doubt that's lawful. So, but people campaigning for a living wage were overawed by military might. Was that a conservative thing to do? Some people say not. It was attempting to deprive them of their liberty. It was attempting to intimidate people for exercising freedom of association and freedom of speech. So everyone has the right to demonstrate for their political views, supposedly the kind of thing the First World War was fought for. The other thing I should point out is, yes, we know 11th of November 1918 the armistice was signed, but the war against Germany didn't end as such till the 26th of June 1919, and not until the Treaty of Versailles was signed. Until that time, negotiations could have broken down and the war been renewed. Okay, that there was the armistice is a cessation of hostilities whilst we see if we can have a permanent peace. It might be that we fail to agree a permanent peace. Now, I know at Versailles, the German delegation wasn't permitted to negotiate. They were there listening to the Allies. They were then presented with the peace, take it or leave it. They might have rejected it, in which case it would have been war again. But that's why in early 1919, the UK was still on a war footing. We know that permanent peace came in June 1919. They didn't know that at the time, so they felt they couldn't take any chances. Anyway, so that January of the year, some 1919, Churchill was party to the decision to suspend Glasgow City Corporation, as in the City Council. Now, many people would say this is an unwarranted intrusion on local autonomy. Conservatives are supposed to care about local government and not want these faraway people poking their noses into local affairs. We believe in subsidiarity. So conservatives are supposed to value local government. But keeping government close to the people, well, that's not what he was doing. It was the second largest city in the United Kingdom, and it was placed under control of the army, which was a staggering intrusion on civil liberty. So we shouldn't stand for such usurpations of rightful authority. Local democracy. This incident is not a triviality which can easily be dismissed with a plea of necessity. I remember, well, I think it was Pitt the Elder said, necessity is the excuse of tyrants, it's the plea of slaves. So this ought to perturb even the most blinkered admirer of Spencer Churchill. So it was deeply wrong to ignore these tanks on George Square in Glasgow. People were stopped and questioned by soldiers in Glasgow when they were simply going about their lawful business. Yeah, you shouldn't have the soldiers questioning you when you're engaged in your quotidian business. What's wrong with that? Just going to work or something. Now, nobody was killed. And again, the plea and mitigation is this is only 18 months after the Bolshevik Revolution. And the Bolsheviks were openly preaching revolution and were seeking to disseminate their views in all capitalist lands. Some ex-soldiers had been radicalized. There was higher unemployment. So British Bolsheviks were frank about their intent to bring this Marxian proletarian paradise to Britain. He was medicated for the black dog besides alcohol. Yes, appears to have depression. He said sometimes he had to stand back from the edge of a building or railway platform lest he be inspired to fling himself off. He sometimes had these self-destructive urges. So that's why he had this self-destruct tendency, like putting himself in harm's way, flying right after the Second World War when there was so many fatal accidents. Flying was very much touch and go. It was very jittery in those days. It was very primitive technology. And, the airplane was an adolescent at that time, if you will, having been invented in only 1903. And so many of his friends were killed in these accidents. Otherwise, he could have been quadriplegic. And what else? That's who was always crossing the street to get into a fight, spoiling for a fight as a soldier, wanting to march to the sound of the gunfire, rushing headlong into danger. I would be running in the opposite direction. And self-destructive with alcoholism, self-destructive financially. He was a profligate spender, financially incontinent. What else can I say about him? Suffered the black dog, as he said. Seems to have bipolar disorder, sometimes down at the dumps, saturnine, choleric, skeptical, what can I say, scabrous and cantankerous, rudely and loudly rejecting sound advice, however courteously delivered. But other times he was hypomanic and just high as a kite, bounding with energy, even as a man aged 75 in the Second World War, leaping over waist-high walls. And some of the teenage soldiers couldn't believe that this man was so energetic, bearing in mind he was very chubby by that stage. But anyway, so back to the 1920s. 1926, he was crucial in defeating the national strike. He even set up a newspaper called the British Gazette to help achieve that object. Now, in this respect, he was at least doing something that conservatives approved of, as indeed most liberals did. Occasionally genuinely conservative. But was that because he actually believed in it? I suspect not. Not that he disbelieved in it either. But by the early 1930s, Churchill was in the back benches. It appeared that his best days were behind him. He was moody. He was reactionary. This grumpy old man. So he would never see the front bench again, or so it appeared. He'd had his day. So he took up the cause of the Tory diehards, especially pertaining to India. He said that the subcontinent should take steps towards self-government, whereas he'd agreed to some self-rule for India in the early 1920s when he was colonial secretary. He'd been party to decisions to advance political reform in India. So by the 1930s, he was adamantine in his opposition to further political development in India. So this backward-looking attitude lost him a great deal of credibility, and that's why people weren't willing to take on board his views with regard to Germany, not seriously. So there's one time Liberal had embraced the most whalebone corseted version of conservatism. Now, I could be here all night, but I need to go to sleep. Thank you, everybody. I think I'll come back some other night and carry on, because it's going to take me, about another 2 hours to go through the conservative case against Churchill. Please follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, George from Ireland. Please donate on PayPal, georgecallahan79 @gmail.com, or indeed on Patreon. That's all. Thank you. Good night.